everybody here to the Vietnamese Film Fest, and especially to our short film section, Love Actualized. And we are joined by some amazing filmmakers today, as well as some actors. So I will start by introducing everyone here. Um, First, I would like to introduce Quentin Raymond, who is the lead in Accidents and Emergencies. I would then like to introduce Duc Anh Nguyen, who is the director of the short film Mike. I would like to introduce Thai Scott, the director of Spit of You. And finally, I would like to introduce Benjamin Tho, who is the director of Infinity. So before we begin, I would like to talk a little bit about Love Actualized and the different ways that love is shown. This is the most international short film series in our entire Viet Film Fest. And we have people coming from Germany, from France, from Australia, from America, all around the world. And no matter where we are thinking of how to combat actualizing love that is spoken and unspoken in very different ways. I'd love to start with that just to think about how you all show the ways that we actualize love in our communities and in through your films. So I would first like to start with a general question. So the first question I have is, how do you explore that full complex form of love in your film, given its connection to Vietnamese culture and identity in non-Vietnamese environments? So I'd like to start with Quentin, and you may begin.
Thank you so much to invite us to the Viet Film Fest. We are very glad that you choose our film. And to answer to your question, I think that the film Accidents and Emergency mainly talk about family love, and our love is a bond that brings us together and help us through life challenges. And I think you say the word unspoken, and I think it's all a matter of unspoken things. And Lindan, the filmmaker, choose to explore these themes through the idea of crisis. Something catastrophic happens, the grandmother of the family fall, and this extreme situation will test the bond between the character. And I think also it's even more complicated because they have this kind of double culture. On the one side, they have the traditional family values of the Vietnamese culture, and on the other, there is the Western culture, and in our case, the French one, and it creates conflicting desires for them. And yeah, so I think what really stands out, it's the difficulty to express love or just saying simple thing as "I love you," and it takes very extreme situation where you will, say or you never say to finally make these simple things comes out.
Great, thank you. Moving on to Đức Anh.
Hi. First of all, once again, thank you so much for the VFF team for putting this together. I really appreciate being a part of this group of filmmakers, and I love the fact that my film got included in this because I'm also very curious to hear from other filmmakers about our experience of love and how, as Vietnamese, our culture, I feel like there's that sort of unspoken love within families that Quentin just mentions that really kind of like tie deep into who we are and our values. And I feel like when you are being pulled away from that, and Mike, the protagonist, when being pulled away from that sort of environment, there's a sense of missing, of longing for that familiarity again, of that culture again, when you're being thrown in a completely new environment, in a completely different culture from what you were born and raised. So for me, I was very interested in exploring that because partly it was based on my own experience of being far away from home and how I didn't realize the importance of the culture and identity and the fact that there is love there. There is comfort that existing within those areas of our life. And in Mike, I was very interested in exploring the protagonist, how he wasn't aware of that sort of form of unspoken love, um, and ultimately sort of shredding it for the sake of not, being isolated within the non-Vietnamese environment he's in South Dakota. And that act of shredding it, you can see with another character who is quarter Vietnamese, Christians, who sort of like this example that Mike is looking at in the form of like, here's me shredding that love that I can find within the culture that I've born and raised in, and how I shred that in order to be accepted within a new environment, and what is the consequences of that. So for me, I was extremely interested in exploring that sort of unspoken love that we don't talk about, but especially I feel in Vietnamese family, we just sense it among our family, among our parents.
Thank you so much again. Moving on to Thai Scott.
Cool. Yeah. I would like to start as well. Thank the VFF team and Joseph for hosting this. It's really cool to find out that we're sort of one of the most international sessions. I think it's really cool to hear about how everyone's doing in the diaspora and learn about love in all these different ways. So super excited to be a part of it. Yeah, I guess this question for me and for Spit of You, I was sort of wanted to explore, I guess, what love can look like and the different forms it can take. I think sort of growing up in Australia, the way we show love can be very black and white or quite straightforward at times. It's a bit more direct, and so there's this kind of I guess cognitive dissonance for the father lap in Spit of You, um, where it's all very unsaid and upholding that kind of masculinity um, ideals, I guess. So yeah, I think looking into that kind of side of myself and then and these characters and working with the actors on it, to answer the question, I guess would be just the small actions and sort of what Raymond was touching on, just like the small things and the things that are unsaid that we do for each other, and even how hard they can be for us and for these characters to get across, especially in an environment like Australia where you know I guess it's kind of assumed that it would be quite easy and you can be a bit more straightforward. So yeah, it's really interesting to explore that in the film.
All right, thank you, Thai. And then moving on to Benjamin.
Hello again. Yes, I'm Benjamin Toe, and I'm the writer-director of Infinity. And I want to thank the Viet Film Fest team again for including our film. It's a great honor and really full circle because I really started coming of age and seeing other Vietnamese filmmakers in this festival in particular when I was in college. So it's a great honor to come back as a filmmaker. Infinity is about two famous Japanese American ballroom dancers in the 40s who come at a crossroads of becoming the greatest dancers of all time or enemies of the state as World War II concentration camps begin to rise in the US. It's something that it doesn't feature Vietnamese characters or Vietnamese culture, but it's informed a lot by my Vietnamese upbringing as a child of refugees. I kind of didn't hear a lot of stories about the motherland or my parents' journey over after the war, just because it was so painful to them. And so I often did a lot of piecing together of our histories and through other communities' histories, and especially through Asian American history. So I learned a lot through that, especially coming up through college. Shout outs to the Ethnic Studies Department at Cal State Fullerton. They really shaped me for who I am today. And actually, in one of those classes is where I found this story in my textbooks. It's about, I came across this story, this real true to life story about these two dancers who were passing as Chinese, but when they were outed as Japanese, they kind of came at this counter Jesus moment of do we flee and give up our passion, or do we stay and for the love of our dance and stuff like that. The actual story was very tragic. They gave up dancing and they never did it again. And so I kind of always fantasized what their final performance would look like. And so the film is centered on this multi-minute long montage of one singular performance that represented from when they first fell in love to when they lost their child to with the breaking of the war. It's an all-encompassing dancing sequence that really it speaks to what you said, Joseph, about the unspoken love of it all, and what greater love and what more intense love that you have than with like another person, whether romantic or personal. And I think that's what we wanted to really explore between a romantic love between two people, but also like a collaborative love between two artists who have so much passion for their art.
Awesome. And I love all these different ways that we're starting to listen to the way that love is spoken and unspoken. And this really helps me transition to the second question about the actualization of love. There's so many different forms of love, and for so many in Vietnamese families, it's either, fulfilled or not fulfilled. And there are so many different ways and paths that people take in order to fulfill those love that was always there. And so I wanted to ask, how do your characters in your film grapple with the actualization of love, especially in the context of Vietnamese families balancing Western and traditional values? We are all in diaspora. I'll start with Benjamin again, and then we'll go backwards.
Yeah, sure thing. I think a lot about like systemic injustice or unjust laws that kind of take away our right to love. You can like interpret how you will in a modern context, but in the context of our film, I think just the sole fact that these folks were Japanese, they were taking their rights away to just simply exist as Japanese American. And I think our particular story is very interesting because it's like second, third generation Japanese Americans. And so it's a little bit different in terms of like the diaspora canon of storytelling, where it's not just immigrants and refugees coming over. It's like characters who were American for a very long time already, but yet they're still not deemed American enough. And so I think, seeing basically the theme of our film is love transcends hate. And I think that is shown through like the dancing, especially because it's a very not very dialogue heavy film. We tried to tell our story as physical and as kinetic as possible. And their love is shown through like their passion of dance for sure.
Thank you, Benjamin. Moving on to Thai.
Yeah, I think so. Spit of You sort of centers around a father and son kind of connecting after the grandmother of the family passes away. And so I guess the way I kind of looked at actualizing love in Spit of You is really how it centers around the son breaking through the father's shell. It's sort of loosely inspired by my own relationship with my dad here in Australia, but I was really fortunate to work with a fully Vietnamese Australian cast, which was a real challenge to get done in Brisbane here, but they're super excited to get that together. But it also meant, we were fortunate enough to all be able to draw on that lived experience. The lead son, Chris, was actually a very similar age to myself, so we had a lot of kind of parallels that we could draw on, and it was really interesting how we could all kind of relate to these acts of service and identified a lot of similarities in the ways we were kind of brought up over here. So and then obviously the father and mother in the film are sort of the similar age that they could be my own mum and dad. So hearing their side of things was also it was quite interesting to hear, and I think it helped the film a lot in terms of actualizing that love when you've got people drawing on both sides of the relationship that we're trying to create.
Thank you, Thai. Moving on to Dukai.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off a little fact that Ty mentioned about how hard it is for Ty to find like Australian Vietnamese to work with his film, which is again an amazing achievement because for me it was our lead actors. He was the only Vietnamese characters in the film. And it was surprisingly hard to find the right person to emulate that role throughout casting here, even though I'm in Los Angeles. So I completely hear you on that front too, even over here. And in terms of like how the film and our protagonists kind of grapple with the actualization of love, I feel like the film is sort of a direct opposite of what Benjamin said, which I love so much that I'm just going to piggyback off, which is that, for his movie was about love transcend hate. For Mike, it was about hate transcends love in the sense that Mike, the protagonist, he has that love. He has that love for his culture. He has that love for his identity in the beginning. He has that comfort that can be shown in the love that he had with his mom, even though they're apart in the world. But racism and ignorance sort of comes into the way of Mike being able to continue loving himself and loving the culture that he was born and raised with. And sort of he doesn't, and as a teenager, when you're in that stage, you are not aware yet of how important that kind of love is, and how you're still in the sort of a way of like trying to find out who you are. And when you're being in like an environment where everyone there is very American in South Dakota, they're very white, and he doesn't really run to another Vietnamese person, there was not another choice of combating racism and ignorance by accepting that hate and sort of just let that hate flow through you. I think that was what Mike was being explore, how that hate kind of go through you and how that sort of makes you do things like abandoning your identity, abandoning your culture, abandoning what you were born, raised, and believe in, and what sort of consequence that might bring. And for me, that is sort of a cautionary tales of how you should look at love that you find within your culture and your identity, and how you can actualize that.
All right, thank you so much, Dreh. And then moving lastly to Quentin.
Yeah, I think it's quite a bit the same for the characters in Accidents and Emergency. The characters of two also doesn't want to leave, to abandon Vietnamese culture, and so she embrace her family duty, even if it's mean for her to sacrifice her own fulfillment. And on the other side, there is the character of Nam, the brother, who choose to reject his culture of origin, and they follow more the model offered by Western culture. And I think in the film, these two characters are some kind of metaphor of the difficulty to finding a balance between the traditional Vietnamese value when you are born in this kind of family, and also the family expectation and the Western value when you have to live in a very different society.
All right, thank you all for sharing. And this is a great segue because all of you talked about so much about how love is actualized, and just as much as how it's not actualized and all of the conflicts that we go through in love. And this is a perfect segue into Quentin's film in Accidents and Emergencies. And I wanted to ask Quentin specifically, how does your film address the clash between caring for family and personal independence in a Western economy, especially when we live in Vietnam? Everyone lives together. In Western economy, there's so many other things we have to think about rather than, loyalty to family, for example. So I'd like to start with you, Quentin. I'll move on to specific questions going on forward.
Yeah, I was talking about the characters of two, and I think she embodies this very brave determination to keep taking care of the family, to trying to keep everyone together, and also especially taking care of the elders. And meanwhile, the character of Nam has chosen independence, which for him means partially distancing himself from his family. Even so, he still wants to meet the expectation of the family, especially in terms of success. That's why he lie a bit or something like that. But yeah, he still choose to sorry, for him, he embodies the independence, the spirit of independence bring by the Western economy for me. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Quentin. And now I want to move on to Đức Anh's film in Mike. And so in Mike, there is a scene where the mother asks him, how are you doing? And he says, totally fine, when he's not. And I really wanted to ask, in Mike, in that lie, how does the protagonist's lie to his mother reflect the experience of Vietnamese international students, or those separated from family who only realize their attachment to family once they leave home? I wanted to ask if you could explore that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I very love these questions. I have not been asked this before, and I found that to be a very profound things to think about. For me too, to re-examine about that seems it is sort of a tragic thing that I feel like many of us kind of experience through, where sometimes we are very far apart from our family. Sometimes a phone call become a text message, which is what happened in Mike because of time difference. And many times how we decide to lie of how we're doing in order, because that is an expression of love for us. It's a form of protecting our loved one from being worried or stressed about our states of beings. It's a complicated thing. It's not always the right thing to do. Sometimes it's a selfish act, but it really sort of helps makes you reflect on how that kind of act is also a form of love that you're expressing toward the other person. Um, and it essentially absolutely showed the attachment he has to his mom, and in a ways to his culture. He's communicating back home through text message. What a like in the modern era, that's the best we can do to show love. But by lying to his mother, he's sort of also lying to himself that he's doing fine, that not being near this love is okay. You're sort of like telling yourself about that. So that attachment becomes something very complicated in a sense that we love them, but also we due to adaptation, to assimilations, to the pressure you have to feel when you're in a different environment, you sort of have to detach yourself from it. And so once again, for me, that seems it's really contextualized for you how Mike is sort of aware of that love, but at the same time, how he decided to get detached from it in order to survive. And that is once again a cautionary tale of the simple choice we make in our daily life that affect our own personal identity, our own personal attachment to our family, and also to our other families who will never know whether we're doing well or not.
Yeah, that's definitely something we think about a lot. And so, want to move on to Thai and the spit of you, and you see these parent-child relationships in two forms. We see it between you see Van and his father Lap, and then you also see a kind of disconnect between Lap, who's grieving for his mother who recently passed away. And so I wanted to ask you, in your film, how do you portray that grief and that love at the same time between generations, especially through the parallels between Lap grieving for his mother, and then Van, the protagonist, trying to struggle to connect with the grief that his father is going through?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I the interesting thing with Spit of You is that the grief is really unhealthy. And for the father character, the he didn't have a role model in his life, and then it's that kind of generational. I think that word was used before, being passed down to Van, and he then doesn't have that role model either on how to kind of deal with this um, sort of grief they're going through, and then they kind of discover, or I guess Van more so realizes that the answer's right there if he can connect with his father um, and kind of break down that barrier that's always been there, um, then they can kind of change that and break the cycle. So I think a big sort of motif that we set on set a lot was, or in terms of when we started writing and developing the film, was how far can the apple fall from the tree, or how far does it really fall from the tree? And like, are we kind of destined to be, with this character Vine destined to be like his father? And sort of, if he can break it, what are the reasons behind that? And so, yeah, it was super interesting to explore that. And I think, yeah, in terms of portraying it, it was I think the cognitive dissonance that they struggle with so much is also the reason that Vine is able to break through where his father couldn't. But yeah, thank you for that question.
All right, and we definitely talked about the some of that separation in the love, and also the kind of sacrifices we make in trying to connect with those that we love. And talking about love and sacrifice and separation, Benjamin, in your film Infinity, it has all of that, but the interesting part is that it focuses on a Japanese American family, and I really wanted to close in that in your film it is about a Japanese American couple during World War II about to be incarcerated. And I wanted to ask about what were the human themes that you were trying to go for when you're conveying this for a Vietnamese American audience in a Vietnamese Film Fest as a Vietnamese American director, especially when we think about the human themes, love, separation, and sacrifice that we have all been talking about so far.
Absolutely. I think this is a great question because it goes into a conversation that I always like to have with other people, other filmmakers, which is people who appreciate history, whether it's like the history books or personal history. I find that the more you learn about other people, the more like you realize we're not so different. And if anything, it helps you empathize with other communities much more. Particularly like, growing up, I would hear whatever like stories I did about my family's journey over from Vietnam. One that particularly struck with me, that like struck a deep emotional chord, was one where my youngest aunt was actually kidnapped during their voyage over to the States. And so when that happened, they never saw her again. And that really deeply affected my grandmother for the rest of her life. And, as a storyteller, I always think about like, especially when I hear like harrowing real stories about like that, I think about second chances or, reunions. Like what would happen if my aunt did get a second chance to converse with my grandmother for one last conversation? And I applied that to the story with these two dancers. I'm sorry, technical difficulties. Are we good? Can you hear me? Should I start over again, Joseph?
Yeah, if you can start again. Sorry.
Let's see. I'll just start from the top then. Sorry. Yeah. So I think a lot about reunion and second chances when it comes to stories like these, because it makes me think a lot about personal history and the history books from the stories that I've learned throughout my studies. Is that the more you learn about other people and other communities, they're not so much different from you. And if anything, these stories really help me empathize even deeper for other communities, especially Asian American communities. Like one story in particular from my personal history that I've heard from my grandmother a lot was like during their voyage over from Vietnam during the war, like my youngest aunt was kidnapped during that time, and so they never got to see her again, and it really deeply affected my grandmother for the rest of her life. And so I always think about second chances and reunions when it comes to these stories when love is ripped apart or there's a separation involved. Um, I always think about like what would that final conversation look like, or if we had a second chance to reunite with our loved ones, what would our last words be? And those last words are kind of like in Infinity are actually manifested in the form of a dance sequence. So the real life dancers that the film was based on never got that second chance, but I kind of like in a fantastical fantasy sort of sequence. I like to portray what it would have looked like and how it represented their entire lives, their love life and their love for their craft. And I did it with like familiar mechanics that we're used to in terms of like the history of cinema. We were really inspired by like MGM classics and like Gene Kelly musicals from back in the day, like Singing in the Rain and American in Paris. Even like The Red Shoes, like which is a British musical. So super like Technicolor, very like eye-catching production design and period specific costumes. But I kind of realized, like, you know, as I loved watching these musicals growing up, kind of didn't see a lot of Asian faces, particularly Asian Americans. And so this was a way to kind of not only like kind of Trojan horse this wonderful, beautiful, like troubled, complicated history that we have in this country, but it's also to reclaim the genre space that, you know, it can be for anyone, especially people who look like us.
Thank you, Benjamin. And thinking of reunions, there are many reunions and other different films that that also symbolize a coming together, especially going back to Quentin's film in Accidents and Emergencies. There's a final film where although the son and the daughter have different lives, they come together and they're both fully accepted, fully loved by when they visit their grandmother in the hospital. And so I wanted to ask you about that ending and what type of message you wanted to convey about that reunion, about hope and about family in general, despite all of the issues, the different lives that the grandchildren led before and the fights that they had.
I think that the final message is love wins. You know, more specifically, I think it's the this unconditional love of the grandmother that ultimately transcend their difference and the difficulty they have to find balance, like I told earlier, between their traditional Vietnamese value and the Western values, and that bring this unconditional love, bring them back together, make them forming a family again, and even give them the possibility to finally welcome a new one in the family, a new member, and this is the Nam's fiancé.
Definitely. And thinking about love wins as the end, love is complicated and sometimes it doesn't always win, or even if it wins at the end, we go through a lot of complex intricacies in order to get there. And so going to Đức Anh and then talking about Mike's, the ending of Mike is very bittersweet and in some side type of sense where he kind of rejects his Vietnamese culture in order to try to assimilate into this new culture. And so I wanted to talk about the title Mike when he changes his name to Mike and his original name is Hiệp. How does this name change from Hiệp to Mike reflect the protagonist's attempt to assimilate? And do you think your ending was meant to be positive? Was it meant to be bittersweet? Tell us about what it means to fit into America, assimilate, and that ending that you chose.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the name Mike and the title appear at the end, that was like always our team's intentions to be able to, at least in the short, give the audience a one transformation, a change for the character, and that we feel like that is sort of the North Stars throughout everything. There is that external change of him, where he begins and he ends with Mike. Very much a generic, easy English name that everybody can pronounce instead of something like here. And so that for in that way, when you look at it that way, his attempt is successful. He has successful assimilations. People are able to call him by a name now. People are being able to recognize him, and in a way, on paper, that it is a success. He has find a sense of belonging in the environment he's in. Is he truly happy with it or not? That is, that is exactly how sort of the ending that we want to leave. We do not want to leave a positive or negative. We definitely want it to be bittersweet because once again, for me, when you are in teenagehood like Mike does, the need to feel belong and acceptance are almost the top priority for every teenagers. And Mike felt that sense of acceptance. That's solely because now his peer call him by his name, and he can be able to communicate with other people. But the name change is a metaphor for how others also perceive him and his culture. And you can sense the sacrifice he has made when he chose to make it Mike. It's accessible, it's easy for him, and it's easy for everyone. But at the same time, it's also his sort of I'm giving up card. It's sort of here you go, your ignorance wins. This I'm going to assimilate. I'm going to adapt the way you view me, the way how you view other people of colors, and the way that you want me to navigate and live in this sort of environment. And when you're a teenager and you make those kind of decisions, there is an impending consequence, and there is a consequence that's going to happen down the line, mostly internally. So for me, I definitely believe in a bittersweet commentary about fitting in that we all would experience when we have to adapt to a new environment and different situations, and how we deal with hate and injustice, which, like Benjamin has said, is very apparent in this country still. So for me, that is sort of like a cautionary tale once again, but also a hopeful message that when people watch, people will realize the consequence you may be doing when you chose to ignore your identity and essentially abandoning something as important as your name.
Definitely. And thinking about, that success on paper, but there's so many emotions that he's going through with his family and him in America as a young teenager. That's not spoken, that's spoken. We talked about this already. So I want to move on to Spit of You and to come back to the concept of spoken and unspoken emotions, things that we see, and then so many of the things that we don't see. And so I wanted to ask in your film, Dai, about love in the family. How does the love as silence, the spoken and unspoken emotions through family that we've seen in other films, shape Vietnamese family relationships to you, especially in a context that is not Vietnam? And how do you try to capture that in your film?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I sort of touched on it before, how I think a lot of the film's stories are all around the dialogue, not the dialogue itself. There actually isn't that much dialogue in the film in the first place, but yeah, it's really um, the little moments. I think it's a different sort of upbringing too, as well to what Vaughn's friends and things like that from school would be experiencing in Australia. So um, yeah, it's these moments where I think it's a lot more comfortable in the Vietnamese culture to sit in these moments without needing to say something or needing to express explicitly how you're feeling or what you feel. It's really through service is what I sort of felt. These acts of service will do a lot of the talking in our relationships, and so yeah, it was again going back to kind of the breaking the cycle in the relationship between Vaughn and Lap. It was about confronting and being more explicit with our emotions is sort of what kind of made the breakthrough, and I guess is sort of a step in the kind of assimilation direction for Lap, even though he's lived in Australia for so long, still being sort of gripping his ideals, his Vietnamese culture so tightly that it's kind of like a step to assimilate, and then for Vaughn also a step to get close to his father. So yeah, I love that question, but definitely a lot of those moments that are unsaid. I mean, I feel in the film are definitely the moments where they do the most talking.
Thank you. And I've heard a saying that, in the West, when we say I love you, we're saying love is words of affirmation. But then in Vietnamese culture, love is definitely acts of service. And I love the way that you kind of show that complexity for Vietnamese in the diaspora who have both cultures trying to show love in different ways. And let's ending these specific questions with Infinity and Benjamin. And your film ends with kind of the phrase that love is infinity, and you decided to name your film Infinity. And so I wanted to ask you, why did you name your film Infinity? All these types of love types of love that we're trying to portray, and what message does the ending convey with the couple's kind of enduring love under the strain of separation and union at the same time?
It's a great question. So at the beginning, before the dance sequence is initiated, our main character June asks her husband, "How much do you love me?" And then it just cuts to black, and then we go into the dance sequence. And so it's meant to be kind of like twofold in a lot of ways. One is just like their literal love for each other, but then their actual love for like existing, like what was their purpose, and their dancing, their art, their craftsmanship is what gives them life. And to have this taken away, I think this is an act of love, but also an act of defiance as well, of saying no matter where we are in the world, no matter what laws are unjust or whatnot that are put forth as barriers before us, we will break them down. And at the end, there is a bittersweet ending. They did end up getting caught and being reprimanded, but I think along the lines of like love being actualized, it's actualized in that line as well, where we cut to the title infinity, and that's like kind of showing like the infinite love that they have for each other. That no matter if we're like caught and thrown to prison, or if we're like died, or what have you, or whatever morose situation that arises, I think like they will find each other no matter what. It's like, if you pass away, your loved ones will find you in the other life. Do you believe in that kind of that sort of love? And I think that's the kind of thing we wanted to show physically and kinetically through the dancing sequence, but also like through their performances too, between June and Sunny, our main characters. But I think the second fold of that within the title is just the passion that my crew and myself had so much for this project and for filmmaking itself. The script was sitting and collecting dust for years. As money came through and then fell apart, we went through so many iterations of pre-production until during the pandemic, my best friends and I just decided to do this ourselves, and we ended up actually self-funding most of pre-production and production, and then we crowd-funded post. And so it's just a lot of like thankless work, and a lot of people don't see the kind of the pain, I guess, behind the scenes of actually doing so. And like I'm sure all the filmmakers on this panel understand that pain, but within that pain is that love actualized that we keep talking about. Is not only the love that are seen in our films, but the love that we put into our films as well. And so I think that title is very twofold for me.
That's a great ending to this panel, because the love is not just actualized in the film, but the love that all of you put into your films to share with everybody that is watching what is love, not just in terms of culture, but all these aspects of human couples, relationship, etc. So I actually want to go back to General, and I want to ask one very last question, General, for all of you to give a. There will be nothing on the StreamYard caption, but what is the last message kind of you want to convey through your films? If you have any last messages for the audience about actualizing love. So we'll just go very quickly, go from Quentin, Đức Anh, Dai, and then Benjamin, and then we'll be able to wrap up from here. So I'll start with Quentin. What message do you have for the audience about actualizing love in your film and in general? Thanks.
Good question. I think the message I have, it's also about the fact you have access to two culture. I think it's having access also to too much, to quantity of love, because you can have the love you have in the country you are, but you also have love in another part of the planet,
Yeah, Đức Anh.
Yeah, I think my message from Mike, our last message would probably in relation to love would be, don't be complacent. Don't be complacent with the love that you have from the culture, and the love you have for yourself and who you are and where you came from. You can find a balance in loving different culture and different environment. There is a balance there. You don't have to, kind of kill away what you are made of and what you believe in order to blend into something else. You can be whole by loving like both sides.
All right. Thank you, Đức Anh. Thái.
Yeah, I love that. Those words you just said there, but I'll probably say something similar, like along the lines of, I think it's about a bit of you. I'd love viewers to kind of think about how brave you need to be, or how, I guess in this case, like man enough you need to be vulnerable with your family, and like I said earlier, how far the apple falls from the tree. Kind of thinking about how far does it really need to. I guess how I feel like, especially as first generation, second generation immigrants, it's and you're assimilated so much in this culture. It's sort of the Western world might be, all you really know, despite having this kind of different culture at home. And you want so badly to be a part of that and be like, well, your friends and things like that. But how far does the apple really need to fall from the tree? Is it bad to be so different to your family? And yeah, and how important vulnerability is with your family when you're in a situation like that.
Thank you, Thái. And then last to end this, Benjamin.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just want to steal something from one of my heroes, Viet Nguyen, who's always talking about this idea of tia buông, which is roughly translates to dividing sadness. And I always think about like communal love first. That's just how, I was raised, and I'm sure a lot of other Vietnamese American folks were raised too. And I think a lot about this in the context of history, and that a lot of people are afraid to know their history because it's just too painful. But for me, I think it illuminates and illustrates a lot of the things that are going on today. And to better understand it and to get a bigger macro picture and blueprint on how to solve it is really understanding history and knowing the stories of others. And so tia buông is something I really think about, like in terms of community, but the world at large, and using that and manifesting it and kind of actualizing that into like our art is really powerful to me.
Quentin, Đức Anh, Dai, and Benjamin, thank you so much for having such a stimulating conversation about how we show love in our communities. And I do want to say from the bottom of my heart how appreciative I am of you all to share your forms of love in the community, and that the way that you all are actualizing love is helping so many second generation Vietnamese in the diaspora and in Vietnam as well think about themselves. And hopefully, if there's one person who leaves this short film set and feels that one of your films changed the way they thought about themselves, their family, their life, and love in general, I think that you have already made an amazing contribution to our communities. And so thank you so much for submitting your films. Thank you so much to Vietnamese Film Fest for hosting these films. And I would like to thank the audience for their time, for listening to these discussions, and moving forward to be able, if you have the chance to watch more films in other short film sessions or in person at the Viet Film Fest in Santa Ana. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day, night, since you are all in different time zones.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.